All right. So this is Econ 330. Sports economics and Professor Lannis. I see a lot of familiar faces, so a lot of you probably already know me. Sorry about Monday's class. Hopefully, it's a good example. Good time to mention I will use Canvas to put announcements up for things like that. I don't foresee any classes in the future having to be canceled. I kind of had an idea that first one might have to be. It was holding out hope, but then I couldn't get out of some stuff. So I put that up on Friday, so you'll see that announcement up on Canvas. Basically, all I wanted you to do is kind of go through those day one slides, kind of it's a summarization of the syllabus. We'll talk a little bit more about it today, but just to kind of be able to go through it a little bit quicker. Shouldn't get us off too much to have it when you're missing that class. So we'll start with, I kind of put in those day one slides a little bit into the slides we'll cover today. But the way that I'm going to go through this course, I'm putting up some material to kind of summarize what's in the syllabus. You don't have to buy a version of this book. We're not really going to use it, or I'm not going to sign anything out of it. But it's got some interesting examples. If you were really interested, I would just say look for an older version of it, older edition. If you really want a physical copy, you get the old used edition for a lot cheaper. But this is roughly the book we're going to use. We're not, like I said, really using a book, but I have to assign one to the course. So my suggestion would be probably, unless you've got the money laying around, there's no reason to buy that book. I'll put up a lot of additional reading throughout the semester. Actually, every week we'll be doing a weekly reading, kind of going through it on Fridays. So I'll talk about that a little more in a second. But I'll put up a lot of additional readings that we'll cover kind of in class along the way up on Canvas as well. And at the beginning of every week, I'll put up kind of the skeleton version of the slides. What we do in class, especially, a lot of you probably had me for stats, a little bit less of the slides are maybe a little bit more complete in my stats courses. I do a lot of work on the board in this class. So I'll have like blank slides sometimes, and it's basically just leaving kind of room open for you to record whatever we're doing up on the board, right? So yeah, I'm filming actually, if you notice too, I start Zoom at the beginning of every class. I record it, but all you're getting is what's ever on the screen and whatever the crappy audio is, because I'm going to be moving around a lot and I'm not going to just stay put. But it's a nice resource to kind of go back, especially if we were doing some stuff once we start looking at a little bit of data in Excel. To kind of have those recorded. I'll be right here working on it. So those are always good to go back and kind of have those as a reference. I figure it's pretty low cost to me to record these. And if you're ever gone, it's not a perfect substitute for class, but it's something, right? So low cost to me, I figure I'll do it along the way. It also gives you another material, another source to kind of go back to as we get closer to exams. These recordings I will put up. Let me see, did I have it here? No, I left it off. So it must be on the day one slides. The recordings, here we go. I believe I had these day one slides. Here we go. All right, I'll post to a playlist on YouTube for this class specifically. So here's the link. Or if you search Professor Lannis, it's currently not up there because I haven't posted any videos under it yet. But the playlist exists. It's like Econ 330 Spring 2023. That'll be the name of the playlist. Once I get today's video kind of posted there, it'll start showing up if you just search Professor Lannis. I'm the only first one that shows up, and you'll see this class's playlist. I might put some additional stuff up there along the way. Maybe as we get close to exam, me working through some practice problems, right? I might use it to kind of just give you additional examples of things that we've done in Excel. I might have some old videos that I can kind of reuse to give you more examples of things. Anytime I do post additional stuff, I'll put up an announcement on Canvas as well to let you know that I'm posting it there. But that is where I'll put kind of any recorded material. Okay. So on top of that, you'll either need a physical version of the iClicker or you can purchase the app on your phone. If you have a physical version of the iClicker, I need you to register it in two places. One on Canvas. So if you go to Canvas on the side, there's an iClicker registration thing. You'll put in if you have a physical remote, you'll put in its number. I also need you to go here, log into your iClicker cloud account or create one, and then under your profile, register your remote there as well. If you're just buying the app, you don't have to worry about registering it on Canvas, right? It'll just kind of automatically sync up once you select on this section. It pops up every day. I bring in Start iClicker. You'll see this class pop up. Okay. And I'll bring them on Friday just so we can kind of do a test run. I won't start using them for points until next week. We don't have class on Monday or Day, so next Wednesday I'll start using those in class. Usually it's a time for me to get some information back from you, how you understand material, but also give you some experience working through some of the types of problems that you might see on the exam or on the homeworks. Yeah. So getting those iClickers registered in 2 locations to get a physical version, just on, don't have to worry about Canvas if you buy the app. What else do I want to say here? So that covers that. So I skipped over this. Basically, how are you going to be grading this class? So exams are going to account for 40% of your overall grade. So you'll have a midterm and a final, both worth 20%. Homeworks are going to get pretty good chunks, so 30%. These homeworks are, they don't might only be 5 or 6 questions, but they're really you have to be very detailed in them, right? And so they'll take a good amount of time. I've generally had at least 2 weeks from when I assign them to when they're due, usually longer, because if we're going through material, I don't want you to have to wait, don't do it right before the due date. We've covered that material 2, sometimes almost 3 weeks ago for some of those early problems, right? So I try to get them out early so that you can kind of chip away at them as we cover material. And I try to write the questions kind of the same chronological order that we'll go through them in class, so that, if I put the first homework out today, the stuff we talked about today might be question 1. And then the stuff we talk about next week might be questions 2 and 3, right? So you can kind of chip away at it a little bit instead of saving it all at the end. I don't have the first homework up yet. We haven't really covered enough material. I'll probably get that up there next Wednesday, that very first homework. Okay. So it'd be about 6 of those throughout the semester, so not a ton. So each one's worth a good amount, which means not doing them will hurt, right? So make sure you're doing these well in advance. If you have any problems, come to me. I think, hopefully those of you who had me, or at least my reputation is, and I'm pretty available outside of class. I've got my office hours up here. Maybe. There we go. So Monday, Wednesday, Thursday from 2 to 4. So we get done with class at 1. I have classes before this, so I'm going to look at food. And then come back to my office. I'll always be there during those time slots. If I'm not, I'll put an announcement on the Canvas. If those times don't work for you, you can send me an email. I'm generally Tuesday, Thursday, they're a lot clearer. I try to kind of schedule meetings and things like that on Monday, Wednesday. So Tuesday, Thursdays, that time slot doesn't work for you, send me an email. We can try to find a time to meet. Also, if you don't like me for whatever reason, my graduate assistant for this class, I've got on there in the syllabus, the Word document that's on Canvas. It's got her office hours. Although to be completely honest, I don't know. I'm using her more for 221, so she can probably help with more of the stats side of this class, but maybe the econ part she would struggle a little bit, but still another additional good resource. What was I going to mention? Oh, so here's the syllabus up here under the files tab on Canvas if you wanted to kind of take a more detailed look at that. So I'm just kind of summarizing it here today. So we'll go back. We're talking about grades. So homework exams, iClickers will be about 10%. So these are meant to help boost your grades. If you don't do as well on the exams or on some of the homeworks, these are pure effort points. You show up, you show up and are moderately paying attention, you should be able to get more than 90% of the points in these iClicker categories, right? Occasionally, I'll use online quizzes on Canvas to replace iClickers, and if I do that, I'll mention it in class and put up an announcement on Canvas. Generally, these will be due before we start the next class. I'm not going to use them a ton. They're more so probably at different points for me to check to kind of see where you guys are at with the material, or some preference-based stuff about exam reviews or topics that you want to see covered. So primarily iClickers, but just wanted to put up there. Occasionally I'll use a handful of times throughout the semester. I might use Canvas for an online quiz. At the end of the semester, I'll drop your 2 lowest. So that means if you're going to be gone from class, and I don't know, I hate questioning people. So if you have a funeral, or if you just have the cold that day, 2 days basically don't show up, and drop those grades, right? I will excuse absences for a couple of reasons. One, if you're in the hospital for 2 weeks or have a really prolonged sickness, I'm not going to be a jerk and say that none of those are excused, right? But in terms of just like a daily illness, we're going to miss one class. Those are kind of what those 2 class periods are built in there for. But if you know, something happens, and someone one semester like, they ended up having appendectomy, right? So they were out for several classes, right? I'll excuse those absences, and obviously probably have to ask for some documentation if it's a serious things like that. Or if it's a university-sponsored event, so if you've got something, you're a student athlete, you've got a club where you guys are doing something on that day, or a different class where you guys are not going to be able to, I don't know what all these other classes do, but for whatever reason you have to be missing during the time period, you can provide me documentation if it's a university-related event, or if it's career-related, right? The whole point of you being here is to try to get, a good start into your career. So if you've got an interview or you want to go to like a job fair or anything like that, as long as you can provide me documentation that usually it's just forward me an email that the interview exists or that whatever it is exists, I'll excuse those kind of career related things as well. Okay. Any questions so far? So the last thing we'll account for this grade will be a kind of semester long project. So this project is meant to be fun and also it creates a little bit more work for me. So there's ways you can help me out with this, right? So let's start here. I'll come back to these weekly readings in a second. So before February 3rd, so that's a couple weeks away, I need you to submit kind of an idea that you have for a semester long project. So we're going to go through these weekly readings, right? And they're basically going to be peer-reviewed articles. So we'll start to see what the structure of those look like. Your project is going to kind of try to mimic those. So I think I've got here, once we get going, you'll kind of notice all of these papers that we start looking at. There's an introduction, some literature review where it looks at previous work that's been done, kind of describing some of the economic principles that we might predict what we would expect to see in this for this problem, the data that was used, kind of some type of regression output. So those of you from 221 who had me, I know that you did some linear regression stuff at the end. I'll go through and we'll review it again, probably a little bit on Friday and then next Wednesday as well. But these papers will give us a bunch of examples where we're looking at some linear regression output and interpreting the results. So that kind of analysis of the results and then a conclusion, right? These would be kind of the main headings of the papers that we look through. As we go through more of them, I think it'll give you a better idea about how you're structuring kind of your paper, your project, right? So that proposal submission is just basically something that you're interested in, a question. This is sports economics, but I always tell people sport, we can actually analyze similar things like arenas for concerts are very similar to arenas for football or stadiums for football, right? So if you go a little outside the box, you want to do something kind of related to like almost the music industry, art museums, or kind of any of the arts. There's probably a way we can kind of use a lot of the principles you learn along the way during the semester to apply them there as well. Instead of just your more traditional kind of sports. Really nothing's off limits. I'll give you a couple examples here in a second. But the part of the project will be having this data component, right? So I mentioned data description and then regression. We're going to need some data. So I'm not going to expect you to go out and gather the data. I've got a ton of sports data laying around, like from this class, but also some different research projects I've done. So all I need you to do is get me a topic or a question you're interested in, and I can start to help you think about data sets that might work to address that kind of topic. And then that has to be real specific. You can kind of keep it general at first in this proposal submission, and then along the way kind of refine it a little bit. But I have this proposal submission date set so that you don't wait to do it 3 months from now to come up with it, right? I want you to kind of get it early so I can help get you the data, because I'm not expecting you all to get the data yourself, right? Some of it is like, I know where it exists. It's kind of free to me, but not to you. So, if you let me know early, I can get this back out to you pretty quick. Okay. So there will be, we'll have to either use Excel. If you've got, has anyone taken econometrics in here? A couple. I don't know. I think it's a finance class or advanced stats. I don't remember. So if you've ever used R or Stata, you can use that in place of Excel. But in class, I'll pretty much at the beginning just show you how we're doing these regressions in Excel, right? And then I'll kind of maybe towards the end of the semester show you some of these other programs like Stata or R. But the expectation is just at the minimum that you just use Excel in this project. That's all I would expect. So I will get a link up on Canvas and I'll point it out in class where it just kind of has the proposal. Well, I didn't want to put it up there and without an explanation. But I'll just leave it sitting up there so that as you kind of choose a topic, you can kind of submit that and I can see them and get to working on them early. If you're not sure, you want to, check it by me, feel free to shoot me an email and say, hey, would this work for the project? Because some of them I might know if you're in between on a couple different ideas. Some of them might be easier to find data on, or might be easier just to approach in general. I can give you a little bit of direction that way. Okay. Let me see. So here's some just previous ones that I've had people do. So one I had like superstar power. So they looked at how does having a superstar in your team or bringing a superstar into your team impact kind of the economic conditions of the city. So if I bring LeBron James in, like, there's a higher demand to watch that team, more people come into the city, spend more money at the restaurants and bars. Like there's all these different indirect effects that could have. So they like use jersey sales, all-star voting. So those are kind of like two measures. One of them was like their actual performance. The other was like the perception, right? Or of people, people actually going out and spending money on the jersey. It doesn't matter if the player's the best player, they're selling most jerseys. We could use that as a definition of a superstar, right? And then kind of how that impacted unemployment rates and income per capita in these cities, right? So the other one I had, this one was one of the most unique ones, but actually looking really interesting, was looking at the structure of WWE and UFC events and seeing that if there were two events on the same weekend, did you actually see that their TV viewership was higher, right? Were they complements, right? Or were they substitutes, right? People either want to watch WWE, but maybe once the UFC is around, they'd much rather watch a real thing than something that's fake, right? So this actually, I believe the results were they're actually complements, which is, I think, kind of interesting. But I would give you something like that. The other one, I had someone do ace versus ace. So this was like, if I take my best pitcher and I match up against yours, and then my second best will be matched up against your second best. But is there actually an advantage to maybe that very first game, I'll pitch my worst pitcher against your best because I didn't have a good shot even if I put my best pitcher up against your best pitcher. I'll probably lose that game, right? My fifth best pitcher against your best. But now in every other game, I can start my best pitcher against your second best and my second best against your third best. Now I'll have an advantage in each one of those subsequent games, right? And trying to see if whether or not that strategy forced by these different playoff structures like playing games, if it actually led to them being more likely to win kind of a playoff series because they kind of had this advantage in 4 of the 5 games, even though they had a real disadvantage in 1. So these are just some examples. You could do really anything related to kind of a sport, any sport question you're interested in. Like I said, could be WWE. I think I had someone do some esports stuff one semester. I even think, if I remember correctly, this might have been for a stats course I did, but I know that someone did like Magic the Gathering. They did it. There's a big data set out there and they kind of did something on that. So anything, is possible. Nothing's really off limits. What was the last thing I wanted to do? Oh, no, where was it? Somewhere back here. Weekly readings, right? So these are the things that will kind of give you an idea about the structure of your course is going to look like. We'll always kind of go over these on Friday. So not this week, but kind of moving forward at the beginning of the week, I'll post usually after class Monday. This next week, I'll probably just put it out Monday since we don't have class. And I'll expect that you've at least looked at it by Friday's class because we'll talk about it at the end of Friday's class for 10 to 15 minutes. And a lot of times I'll have questions associated with that so I can tell whether or not you read it. Now, the first week, so next class and then next week on Friday, I won't expect you to answer questions on it. And I'll kind of go through these papers and kind of show you how you should read them. I'm not expecting you, some of them like 20 pages, I'm not expecting you to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and understand every single thing that they did. But I'll show you kind of how you can kind of go through it pretty quickly, even in 5 to 10 minutes, figure out what the main question is, figure out kind of what data they used, what was the main result they had by just looking at some key points in the paper, right? So I'll show you how to do this the first 2 weeks, and then kind of from there on out, on every Friday, I'll expect that you have read this paper, okay? Does that make sense? Questions on that? Okay. So I think that covers syllabus of it, unless there's any other questions. you guys had on the syllabus. So I think one thing I had these set of questions. If you don't have paper, I've got some at the end of class. But I'd like if you could all just answer these 4 questions and leave that with me. So we can do that in class, and I'll put these back up there. But it gives me a little bit more information about you guys, and then also kind of how I can structure the class. So this one always just gives me like an idea about people's interests or kind of the reason why they're here. Knowing the different math levels is always good for me to know. Different majors, I kind of see certain majors have different interests, and I can kind of be a little bit heavier on certain topics if we have, you know, predominantly marketing majors versus finance or whatever. And then just kind of where you're at. I don't think there should be any freshmen in here, because 221 should have been a prerequisite, because this is sports economics, but I'll incorporate a lot of data into it throughout the semester. We'll see the theory and then see whether or not the data supports it. Okay, so I'll put these back up at the end of the class, and I'll kind of have some extra paper up here if anybody needs any. Just kind of leave your responses here with me. So we're going to jump over here to week 1 lectures, and we already talked about the project. Here we go. This is where I want to start. So I'm going to go down here on slide 10, and we're going to start there. So this might help you think of ideas that you could use for your project, but it's just more general, right? So sports economics, like, we're going to really be taking a lot of the basic principles you learned in ECON 201 and just applying it to sport examples, but also see how some of these sport examples are a little bit novice, right? They're not as like easy as like these perfectly competitive markets. Okay? So really, when I think about sports economics, there's a couple different categories. So one could be that we have sport performance questions, right? So does the, you know, crossing time zones impact team's performance? Does start times impact team performance? Does being in the last year of your contract impact player performance? Rule changes, right? If I have rule change in the sport, how does that impact the number of goals scored? Or how does that impact, you know, some of the other metrics if I have a rule change? So these are all like specific to the sport, and they're very like performance based, right? How are the teams or the players performing? The other ones we can think about are firm or player specific, right? So it's not just kind of these institutional things, but it might be something like, well, how would allowing beer sales at some of these colleges impact overall ticket sales, right? Or attendance, right? And so that's not really a sports performance thing, right? It's kind of related to the firm, right? A lot of the player specific stuff we'll be looking at like contract year and like, or maybe thinking about how different things a player does can impact their salary. But those are, you know, can be a little bit more, they're not just specific to beer sales and attendance, right? That's telling us something about complementary goods, like a more broad general economic kind of question. The other one is simply having a general microeconomic idea, right? Some type of theory, and just using sports data to prove it, right? So this could be something like, you know, I might want to understand how people behave in winner-take-all tournaments. Well, I can use golf data to understand that, right? Because the winner takes the main prize. There can be several prizes, but they're kind of decreasing in value. And so that tells me something about how people just perform in general in tournaments. I'm just using sport-specific data. Another one, do consumers discriminate, right? So we'll look at a paper later on in the semester where it looked at TV viewership for games that had white versus non-white quarterbacks, and whether or not there was some type of consumer discrimination going on, right? Controlling for like the quality of the quarterback and everything like that. And then maybe we just have general questions about people fall victim to sunk costs. So one thing that we see is if we look at players that have huge guaranteed salaries, if we're looking and controlling for their performance, they tend to get more playing time than someone who's performing exactly the same, but doesn't have as big of a contract. Well, the money's already been spent. You shouldn't be making, you shouldn't be using that to make any of your decisions. You can play whoever the best player on the team is, regardless of what their salary is. So we'll look at some of these examples where it's just a general question of do people fall victim to sunk costs. We're just looking at sports data to see if they fall victim to it in those arenas. Okay? So I think the most interesting ones are these, because like you're just using a sport specific example, but you can make statements about a much broader topic, right? So some of the research that I'm done and doing is on like consecutive free throws and if a hot hand exists, right? So this idea of a hot hand is that, if I flip a coin every single time, 50% chance I see heads or tails, right? Well, if I flip it and I get heads, a lot of people think that the next coin flip, it's a higher likelihood I see tails. Or if I see 5 heads in a row, it's more likely I see a tail. It's 50% every time. You should always be betting on it like it's a 50% chance. But if we look at, basketball shooting, right? If I make the previous shot, well, my same underlying probability of making a free throw hasn't changed. I'm as good of a free throw shooter on my first free throw as I am on my second, right? But maybe there's some type of like neurological thing where I think they call it like neuroplasticity, where your brain can remember the exact firings to be able to mimic a shot that was successful. Your body can remember, or it kind of builds in what those responses, those synapses were, so that you're more likely to make it on the second, right? Because you now have this kind of learned behavior. So there's all these general questions we can ask, and that would apply, like hot hand can apply to like anything. Betting behaviors, like I said, sports performance. So we can kind of use these sports-specific examples to understand a much broader kind of general point. So then the rest of the class, I'll kind of set up today why we're interested in looking at sports markets. But I mean, some of us might be sports fans, some of us might not be. I'll assume you know nothing about any sports that I'm talking about. I'll talk about some sports that I don't know a whole lot about, right? I can understand that. I mean, when I say I don't know a whole lot about, it's not like I follow them avidly. Like I understand the economic principles that are at work within that specific industry or sport industry, but I may not know like who the best player is, right? So why does it matter? Why might we want to focus on this? Well, I already mentioned it's not going to be as simple as kind of our perfectly competitive markets, and there's a lot of market power issues that arrive in sports sports industries, but also just the vast size. So I pulled a couple of numbers. This is like the most recent ones I could get. So in 2020, advertising for the Super Bowl was up to like $550 million. It's a lot of money for one event. I think this was the last. It's actually down, I believe, from the year before, but over 20 million viewers for the semifinals for the college football championship. I haven't seen the numbers from Monday's game. The top viewed things on TV, the first 8 are all sporting events. I've got the data, I'll pull it up here in a second. They're all higher than the State of the Union. Right? I don't know if that speaks highly or poorly of our country. I guess you can go either way, right? But these are a lot of views, which means a lot of advertiser dollars, right? People spend a lot of money. So these are like some rough estimates. I forget exactly, they've looked at kind of apparel sale. They kind of went across industries and tried to do a lot of surveys to ask people how much money they were spending. So take these with a grain of salt, but they're probably pretty close to being accurate, at least in the ballpark. But I mean, people spend a lot of money. So ticket sales, apparel, everything. I mean, we're talking about multi-billion-dollar industries here, right? And that's if we break it down by sport. If we combine them all together, we've got a huge industry.
Inclusive of the gambling industry with it.
So this would just be money that was spent that would have went to teams. So ticket sales, apparel, anything that's in terms of like how much money. So that's something that's hard to get data on because these companies are like so it's pretty like a human house. But I have no clue. I wouldn't even know. I'd have to look it up. I don't know off the top of my head. But yeah, the sports betting industry right now is blowing up, right? So it's going to be a huge component of this as well. Yeah.
So this doesn't include like the costs behind it, right? Because like there's a significant amount.
No. This is definitely going to be the total amount that's kind of spent by fans, right? It's not accounting for the fact that there's any of the costs. This is like purely revenue, right? Now, if you want to break this down, we'll get into a little bit more. The per game revenue, right, is going to be way higher in the NFL. There's way fewer games, right? 10th of the games, 162 versus 16, 17, about a factor, right? So yeah, if we did like per game analysis here, like we'll start to see that the demand for these different sports is significantly different, right? But these are just some rough estimates, kind of give you an idea about how large some of these are. Before we kind of do review markets, I'll show you the data because I think it's kind of interesting. So I had this up under the files tab on Canvas as well. It's called like TV views data. So this is just, now I should, who did I pull this from? It wasn't Nielsen. It was some other company that kind of summarizes TV viewership data, and they had it for the last year. I'll try to have it for next class because I forget now. But basically, I mean, you can kind of see our top 8 events are all NFL games, which is wild. I mean, this really starts to highlight like the level of demand in the NFL right now is insanely high in the US market, right? And then we've got what? State of the Union. We got a bunch of other playoff games, just general NFL games. You start to see, okay, here's some college football games now down here. But right, this is like of all, comparing this to the Golden Globes and all the other stupid things that people watch. This is it. I shouldn't say it, but this kind of shows, the TV market is going to be, there's a lot of advertiser dollars thrown around these different sports. Okay. So we'll do a little bit of review of just kind of general markets, because I'm going to assume that, you don't remember everything from 201. I don't know how long ago you took it. So we'll kind of do a basic review of some economic principles. And like I said, on Friday and next Wednesday, I'll probably do some linear regression review as well, some stuff from 221. Okay. So we've got, market is just going to be a collection of these buyers and sellers. A competitive market is one where no buyer or seller has an influence on the price. So I'll go through it more precisely here in a second. But if we're thinking about these markets, the output and the price, right, of whatever good we're looking at, we'll say there's this upward sloping supply curve, this downward sloping demand curve, and we identify equilibriums by where those two things are equal, right? So I'll give a little bit more insight into that. So I always kind of teach it as supply is telling me the marginal cost of providing these different number of units, while demand is telling me how much the consumers are marginally benefiting, or the additional benefit they get from consuming these additional units. Right? So for every quantity down here, if somebody buys, the marginal benefit to them is very high for this maybe first unit, and the marginal cost to the producer supplying is very low, they can come to an agreement. Right? Any price within here, they'd both be okay. I mean, one of them would hurt a little more than the other, but right, I'd be willing to pay up to whatever my benefit is, and I'm only going to take at the very least however much it's costing me to produce that. Right? That'd be the point where I had zero gain, right, as the producer. So for every unit, kind of up to this point, we can kind of come to an agreement up until they're exactly the same. We'll say at that point, both sides would be indifferent about kind of selling or purchasing that good. But then at every quantity past this, well, there's now no price, right? This is the last price that the suppliers would take. There's no price that they can set, because they don't want to set anything below that, that would be above that consumer's benefit, right? So if the suppliers will only take a price that's up here, well, now the additional cost of the consumer is way higher than their benefit. We'll never see that transaction occur. So that last kind of unit on the market is where that supply and demand curve intersect, because that's where the marginal cost and the marginal benefits are the same for the producers and consumers. Okay. So this would be a kind of a competitive market, right? We've got this equilibrium point. Everyone's a price taker. So I think I've got kind of be a little more specific, right? Demand, this demand curve is going to be downward sloping, which reflects that the very first unit is always going to be more beneficial than the 100, right? So this would be the idea that the example I use in my general econ courses is like, after I mow the lawn, the first beer, I have like a huge marginal benefit to, right? Like a nice cold beer after it's a hot day in the mowing lawn. The second one, yeah, it's a benefit, but like not near as satisfying as the first one, right? I would have paid a lot more for that first beer than I would to have a second, right? And then you can kind of go down the line and get to like the 10th beer and things start getting bad. Like I definitely don't want to buy that 10th beer. So this is the idea that the marginal benefit is declining, right? We kind of think here, and this one actually, I guess it depends on the individual. Preferences are always different, but you can think about it, even if we had not just an individual demand curve, but like a market demand curve, it would reflect that for some people who have a very high marginal benefit to attending games, they might be willing to pay much higher ticket prices, right? But then as that price would get lower and lower, there's now more and more people who'd be willing to purchase tickets, right? Because some people, yeah, they had a pretty high marginal benefit to attending the game, but not near as high as some of the other people, right? If we're thinking about this as kind of a market demand curve reflecting demand from every individual. Excuse me. I kind of already mentioned we can think of demand reflecting the marginal benefit, so that people will be willing to pay up to whatever their marginal benefit is, or they pay a price up to wherever we'd be at on that demand curve. Okay. For our demand equation, we'll be using some equations here in class and kind of Actually doing a little bit of math. But the general form is right. We're going to take our y-axis variable, which is the price, and write it as a function of our x-axis variable, which is just the quantity demanded of good X here. So A and B are going to be numbers, right? When we're using examples, where A would represent what? I was going to plot this on my graph. It's my intercept, right? It's going to be the price where a quantity of 0 would be demanded, right? So quantity of 0 is demanded, 0 times anything is 0. My intercept A is going to be where that price for my demand curve starts out at. And then B should always be what for the demand curve? So it's the slope, right? So B here, if this is the slope of my line, should always be negative, right? It's downward sloping. But it tells me how much the price will decrease or how much I need to decrease the price to sell one additional unit. Okay? So we've got this negative slope, we've got the intercept value, and then kind of the definition of the slope, like I said, it's the required price change to increase the number of units by 1. Okay. Is this kind of ringing a bell, or at least remember this a little bit? So I think at a team apparel here, we could do any good. We'll talk about how the ticket market's a little bit different, but for now we'll think about like a perfectly competitive market being maybe like the apparel market. Okay. For supply, right, we have the exact opposite, which is that producers are going to want to supply the very first unit, right? And they're going to create that unit using the most effective workers first, or being able to kind of have the lowest per unit price. Right? So my marginal cost, as I want to produce more and more, I'm going to have to hire less and less effective workers, and I get kind of this increasing marginal cost. Okay. So law of supply is that if I want to supply more to the market, the price that I'm going to sell that good for is going to have to be higher, right? So going from that first to whatever 100th unit, the price that is required to supply that many units is going to be higher. Okay. What else I want to say here? So we already talked about it representing marginal costs, increasing marginal costs as opposed to decreasing marginal benefits. We kind of have this, eventually we'll have this point where those two things are equal, and we would kind of call that our equilibrium. Do a very quick kind of review here. Same thing for supply. We can have a supply equation where A represents our intercept, right? B represents our slope. But if we have these increasing marginal costs or this increase in supply curve, now our slope should be positive, right? So if I ever give you kind of a supply and demand equation, if I have a negative slope in the equation, that should be the demand equation. The positively sloped one should be our supply equation. Okay. So we also can see things that shift demand. So we'll talk about demand shifters and supply shifters a lot. So we've got some basic summary slides up here in just a second. We'll talk through some maybe sport specific examples and kind of think about what that would look like. But basically a demand increase is going to be what here? So if I've got my demand curve, what would a demand increase look like? So I try not to think about these as moving up or down because that can be a little bit confusing when we think about supply. Demand increases, we can think about as shifts to the right, right? Now, the reason why is because if demand is higher, we can think about at every single price, a higher quantity is purchased. And it doesn't matter what price that is, the quantity purchased is going to be higher at every single price. So our new demand curve, kind of this rightward shift. Well, there we go. It has this rightward shift, okay, or this increase in demand. Whereas a decrease in demand would be a leftward shift. At every price, a lower quantity is purchased. Okay? So we've got this demand increase. Demand increase, moving from our old demand curve to our new demand curve. And then a demand decrease would be moving to the left, right? And like I said, I kind of choose like the terms up or down because that gets a little bit confusing once we look at supply. So the demand shifts, I think, are a little bit easier. And the things that will shift demand, so the number of buyers. So we're thinking about this represents the demand of the entire market. If I have more people, then the demand for NFL apparel is going to be higher. Right? There's just more people demanding. Right? So if I have a higher number of buyers or I see population increases, we'll expect to see demand curves increase, right? So one thing that we'll start looking at is thinking about ticket markets, and each city would face a higher demand curve, right? Depending on their population, income of the population, things like that. So we've got increased number of buyers. Anything that increases income, if it's a normal good, we would expect that to also increase demand, right? So we've got normal goods. This is kind of our most goods in the sports industry we're going to be thinking about are going to be normal goods. The one I can think about that would be an inferior good, right? Which is if income goes up, I actually see demand decrease. Can you think of maybe an example of a sporting good that you might buy less of if you have more money? It's kind of a weird one. So I generally think of like minor leagues, right? As being like, if I have more money, I start to substitute away from attending maybe minor league games to attending professional games, right? So, there could be examples of inferior goods there, right? It's actually interesting, like, you might think about it's interesting to look at some of the locations of minor league baseball stadiums. They're generally like in cities that are, I mean, like Fort Wayne, Gary has one. Like you're thinking about lower income areas, and actually probably because they are inferior goods. If you started to put them in like too affluent of neighborhoods, you may not actually do as well. But I digress. So income changes, we can think about. We also have substitute goods, right? So the idea of substitute goods, they're used in place of one another. So if the price of good Y goes up, and I want to think about what happens to the quantity demanded for X, if there's substitutes, when the substitute is more expensive, I start to buy less of it and more of X, right? Y becomes more expensive, I'll purchase more of X as opposed to Y, right? So substitute goods, we kind of see price and quantity moving in the same direction. You see here. I always think of kind of an example here. When I was at Purdue, the Ohio State Purdue games might as well have been a home game for Ohio State. So it's really difficult to get Ohio State tickets, or they're really expensive. It's not that bad of a drive over to Lafayette. And so you get a lot of Ohio State people who couldn't get tickets to regular season games. Well, Purdue tickets are really cheap because they're generally not that good. So they would come over and fill up half the stadium, right? As the price of kind of Ohio State tickets got higher, the quantity of people attending the Purdue football game in Lafayette actually went up, right? So these kind of substitute good example. We could also see complementary goods. These are goods that are used at the same time. So there it works a little bit different. So when we're thinking about complementary goods, the price of Y goes up. Well, if I have to use these at the same time, so let's say, a basketball hoop and a basketball, right? The demand for people buying them. Well, a basketball all of a sudden becomes $400. What do you think probably happens to the demand for basketball hoops? Goes down, right? Because it's like the complementary good. It's almost like the total price is, well, I need both of these. I need a basketball and a basketball hoop to shoot around in my driveway, right? Well, one of them becomes insanely expensive. I don't really want the other one anymore, right? So anytime the price of a good goes up and the quantity demand of another good goes down, that's a signal that those are complementary goods, right? And the exact opposite of what we have for substitute goods. Another good example of complementary goods, basically anything that a stadium sells. So I put the price of beer, food in the ballpark. If it became astronomical, I mean, it is pretty wild. I think I pay $12 for a beer at one of these events once. I felt bad about myself. So, but if the price of parking or something goes up. So I went to a game, Royals game in Kansas City, and these stadiums are out away from everything, and it's I've never been to one like this. It's a massive parking lot. I mean, massive parking lot by these two stadiums. The baseball and football stadium are right next to each other. But that's where you have to park. There's not there's somewhere to park where you can walk over. You have to park there, right? So if all of a sudden parking, tickets to this Kansas City Royal game in the middle of the season when neither team was really that great, I watched them play the Cubs, tickets were super cheap, right? $20. Well, if parking's $200, it doesn't really matter. The price of the ticket is only 20, right? I have to park there. There's nowhere else I can park. And so these complimentary goods, beer, food within the stadium, or parking, and kind of think about really good examples of complimentary goods with tickets, right? So I kind of had just a more general kind of outline of these things that increase or decrease demand that we just kind of really quickly went through, kind of summarized up here. We'll talk more specifically about like the ticket market and shifts in demand there. I'm just kind of doing a little bit of recap here for us. Okay. Much time we have left. Okay. So I might hold up on this. We'll do supply shifters next class, and we'll talk about equilibrium. We'll do a little bit more review of kind of just general supply and demand, perfectly competitive markets. And then I'll do a little bit of linear regression review as well. So we won't really get to jump into anything too exciting this week. Kind of setting us up. So we have our basics of 201, just a refresher. Basics of some of the 221 stuff we need as a refresher. We'll look at a paper about beer sales and attendance actually on Friday. So that's pretty interesting. You'll see that pop up on Canvas. Like I said, for this first week, you don't have to worry about reading it. I'll kind of show you on Friday how I want you to go through these papers for future class periods. Okay? So get those iClickers registered or kind of get the app on your phone. If you have any questions or any project ideas early on, let me know. After the first week or two, it'll probably be a little bit easier as I kind of see some of these papers. I mentioned some stuff in class, just the different types of topics we can cover. Other than that, I'll put those 4 questions back up. If you can write down a piece of paper, your answers. If you don't have paper, I can come around real quick here. But if you could answer these and leave this with me on the way out, I would greatly appreciate it. Please. Anybody else need? That's good.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I think you know you last semester. I was talking about I had a job lined up. And I'm not be here most of the time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about that. I meant to email you back and say thank you for reaching out.
Yeah.
But I think I'm asking someone else in the class for notes every day, and then using the lectures you post on YouTube to supplement that.
Yeah.
My only concern is like the iClicker. Is there anything I can do outside of class, like potentially kind of go in for that?
So yeah, let me send me another email and I'll think of something we can do with this like so that.
Okay.
And probably should be okay. We didn't know it was like painting a lot of people do.
They're right.
But yeah, I'm about to
go.
Thanks.
Maybe they can have a question.
Yeah, how long?
So it's supposed to start January 25th and last until exactly. But I don't know if it will last until then.
And would it be all week or?
It would be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I have to leave here at 11 and then I get back at 5:30.
Okay. Yeah, I think if you want to try to do it, like I said, if you ever have questions or you need help, or I think you're there Tuesday, Thursday too.
Yeah, well, I'm not there Tuesday, Thursday.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'll be around. So if you ever have questions or something, over in the material, hopefully that would be time where you can kind of keep up to date.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, shoot me an email and I'll think of something to replace this.
Awesome. Thank you.
I still haven't had my kid yet, so.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so the induction date's next Wednesday.
I was gonna say, it's gotta be getting closer.
Yeah, so it was supposed to be before Christmas, but here we are, so.
Well, hopefully everything
I don't know
Everything
what
goes
day I
smoothly.
Might not be there.
It's all good. I understand.
I'll let you.
All right.